Welcome to Hollywood and Sip. I'm your host, Kat Smith, and with me today is Thom Zahler, who is a cartoon artist and writer. And I have you here because Love and Capes is coming out in, is it September from IDW?
Yep, September, the new volume, Love and Capes the Family Way.
I love it. And I had first met you at Comic-Con when you were promoting Love and Capes, and that was several years ago. You remember what year it was?
Oh, it was
2013?
at least, yeah, 13, 14, and it was about that long ago.
Yeah. And so I've discovered, though, that you have a lot of other projects. So we'll start with Love and Capes, and then maybe we can cover a couple of the other ones.
Sure.
All right. So tell us the story of Love and Capes. I think it's the most romantical, brilliant concept ever.
Oh, thank you. Love and Capes is a superhero romantic comedy. It's about a superhero who says, I love my girlfriend and I'm going to tell her that. But if I have to tell her that, I have to tell her everything. So is there ever a good time to tell your girlfriend you have x-ray vision? What does she want for Christmas when she knows you can crush coal into diamonds? I started it all the way back in 2006. Some of it came about because as much as I liked what they had done with Superman when he got married to Lois Lane, he proposed to her, they were engaged, and then 6 months later he says, oh, hey, there's this thing I didn't tell you, I'm Superman, and it didn't seem like that's what you should do. So what I decided to do was write about all the in-between moments as opposed to focusing on being a superhero. The whole thing focuses on their relationship. It's very much like an 80s or 90s sitcom where people have jobs but you don't really see them do their jobs. It's all about the things that happen when they're not at work.
And if somebody has been reading your stories all along, so they were a fan back then and they didn't realize that the past year you've had more comics coming out, where have the characters come from start to this new volume?
Okay, each volume covered a particular chunk of their relationship. So the first one was dating, the second one was when they were engaged, the third one is their newlywed year, and in the fourth one, they have a child. And in the time of the fifth one, we jump ahead 5 years. They have two kids, and that's where it starts off. It's them raising a family. Things have happened to other characters. Darkblade and Amazonia aren't dating anymore. Other things happen with other characters that I don't want to spoil too much of. But yeah, it picks up. I try to make all my comics accessible. I used to be part of Free Comic Book Day, and that was always the best promotion I could get, but it taught me very particularly to make sure to write a book that someone could come in on the middle of and still know what was going on. So even if you haven't read the stuff before, it's pretty easy to get into this one.
I love it. And then are you a family man? Do you base this on your own family life?
I am not married. I have a girlfriend. I am stealing from all my other friends' lives at this point.
So if you're a friend of
I
Thom
have
Zahler, you might end
yes,
up in his comics.
yes. I have two adorable godkids and nieces and nephews, and I steal a lot of that stuff for this current run.
I love it. And then I read that you also were doing something kind of unique in that you were dedicating or changing the books a little bit to help local heroes and local comic shops. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Sure. IDW for volumes 3 and 4 printed individual issues and then did trades. With 5, for bunches of reasons, they decided that they didn't want to do the individual issues. So what I was doing was I was selling individual copies of the books because I've worked as a graphic designer and a printer enough that I can generate books. I know how to make them and get them into people's hands, but it's just selling them at conventions. When this whole pandemic thing happened and everything shut down and conventions went away, comic book shops were having trouble getting new material. And I worked with a printer who was able to create books that were branded particularly for the store. So there's if your store is Captain Blue Hen, there's a big Captain Blue Hen logo on it. And I was able to get the 6 individual issues that are collected in the trade coming out in September, get them to comic book shops so they had some new material over the dry spell.
Will you be continuing on with Abby and Mark's story, or are you moving on to other characters?
Right now, I'm moving on to other characters. I'm not done with Love and Capes. I had always intended to get where I got at the end of the 4th volume, and that was very much going to be that was exactly where I was trying to get to. And once I did that, I didn't know how to come back. And it wasn't that I didn't want to, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome and stay past what the story should be, because I think stories should have endings. And then I was talking with my friend Greg Weisman, who created the Young Justice cartoon. And he said, "Oh, I got an idea for you." I'm like, "Oh yeah, what's your idea?" Guy who worked on Star Wars Rebels and Young Justice. And he gave me the idea to time jump it. And once he did that, that solved every problem that was holding me back. And then I realized what the ending of the next 6-issue arc was. I'm like, okay, now I want to come back for it. And I definitely want to do more, but I'm trying to do it at a reasonable pace. So I've got other things I'm working on. I will come back to it again. Like, I'm not as done with it as I was before, but I always want to make sure that I have the right story to tell.
I love that. That's a good way to break any kind of writer's block. Just jump ahead or jump back in time.
Yeah, get to arguably the more interesting point. With Love and Capes, I didn't want every volume to be about a year in the life of the kid. I thought that was a little too artificial. By jumping it to have 2 kids, I can play around with newborn, and I can play around with a kid going to kindergarten. And that made it a little easier to cover that ground, which I thought that was really interesting. And it was fun to do.
So let's talk about some of your other projects. I love the concept of Warning Label. I didn't get to read any of it yet, but tell us about Warning Label.
So Warning Label is about a girl who's cursed by her ex-boyfriend, that every guy who asks her out gets the warning label of what they need to watch out for. So it opens up when Danielle is at a bar and this guy starts coming on to her, and she kind of says, wait for it. And then he asks her out, and then there's a flash of light and the warning label appears. The thing about the thing on the list is that they're all real things, but she can change them. And he writes a list of his own failings and gives them to her, and they slowly become better people.
Oh, that's awesome. I was going to say, can you even imagine? Of course you can imagine, you came up with the story, but going into every relationship knowing what you have to tackle, it's a blessing and a curse, I suppose.
Yeah, it's leading with your worst quality, but it's kind of, I had this epiphany about my goddaughter. When they're born, they're super cute and adorable, and you get hooked into them, so that when they're 2 and screaming and yelling and tearing stuff up, you're already beat in, or you're already bought in. So the same way with Warning Label, it's leading with the worst part. Like, you're getting that stuff out of the way, but it's kind of hard to build a relationship when you're leading with your worst self.
I had that epiphany about puppies too.
Mm-hmm.
So that comic is on the platform Webtoon. What is that platform?
So Webtoon is an international company, mostly based out of Korea, but they made a big push here in America 3 or 4 years ago. I forget, because I went into art, so I didn't have to do math. But they have a lot of American creators like Katie Cook and Pepe Nicieza and Dean. I'm going blank on his name. Dean Haspiel. But so it is built to be a weekly format. Roughly speaking, it's about 5 pages of comic a week that appear on the site. And it's built to be infinite vertical scroll. So when you're on your phone, you're scrolling through it this way. So you're not trying to get really long panels to fit on a phone that looks like that. You're actually getting, it is built for the platform that it is. And that makes a lot of difference. And then having in those bite-sized pieces, a lot of people trying to do digital comics, I feel, have been trying to make a 24-page comic work on a phone, and that doesn't necessarily work. But knowing and just buying in completely to what your target of where the book is going to be makes all the difference in the world for telling the right kind of story.
Well, and that makes sense. It's the evolution of comics because, in our day we held things, we were very tactile, and now everybody's on their phone and everybody's scrolling. So it just makes sense, if you want the art form to survive, you have to adapt it to how the readers are going to view it.
Yeah, and I think TV and film has shown us that not everything is everything. I mean, we've now gone from movies and miniseries to individual TV series that can span for 7 years, and then 15-minute YouTube shows. Like, nothing has to be the solution for everything. And the same way that Webtoon isn't the perfect place for all comics, but it's the perfect place for a certain set of comics. I don't think, anytime I hear people talk about digital, it feels like people are looking for what the new thing is going to be. And I don't think it's the new thing that everything's going to be. It's just going to be another quiver, or another arrow in the quiver.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of arrows, your other comic over there is Cupid's Arrow. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. That's about 2 Cupids who get couples together. They're kind of hitmen for love. The idea is that you have to shoot both people in a relationship to get them together. That's why they're in pairs. It's very much built out of my love of things like The Thin Man. I just like screwball romantic comedy banter things. So it's about two cupids who don't realize that they should be together when the book starts, and they get together. Sometimes the stories are short, sometimes they're longer, but they're always getting different couples together. They can enter the narrative, so suddenly they become friends of the character. It's a nice way to shorthand them into the story. There are limitations that come with it, but you get to tell all sorts of different stories. From I did a couple that were in a theater group that needed to get together. I did a couple Disney princesses that got together. Just all sorts of. It's nice because it gives me a completely different format to play with. It's very TV episodic, where there's an overarching plot, but then there are the big plots that take up like 6 chapters that you're generally following.
It's the Love Boat with Cupid.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you focus a lot on love stories and relationships. Is there a reason behind that, or it's just what you're drawn to?
It's kind of hit them where they ain't. When I started working on comics, the first thing I did was an action adventure spy book. I particularly didn't do superheroes because so many people do superheroes, and there's no reason to compete with DC and Marvel because they kind of own that space, but there are things they're not doing. And in writing that, I found that I really liked writing the banter between these two characters. And then I found that with Love and Capes, that succeeded, that I realized that there is a market that's not being served, and I'm not bad at it. So I've kind of directed my fire there, because there's no point in me doing the kind of story that everybody else is doing, because like I said, DC, Marvel, Image, they have different amounts of talent and different amount of budget to play with, but there's lots of comics are about superheroes having fights. There are very few comics about people in happy relationships. So that gets noticed a lot differently because nobody's doing it. Right. Or very few people are doing it.
And then with webtoons, do they come to you with a story idea, or do you go to them with a story idea? Is it kind of like a podcasting platform for comics?
So I pitched them a bunch of stories. They came up to me at Baltimore Comic-Con and discussed working with them. They had seen other work that I had done. They had bought one of the books that I did, and they liked it a lot. So then I pitched them a bunch of ideas, and the first time they picked exactly the one I didn't think they would go with. I didn't think they would pick Warning Label. When they did, there was kind of a moment of, oh, so
now I have to write it.
Yeah. It seemed a lot easier when it was just this dialogue, just the concept. And the same thing happened with Cupid's Arrows, although I had a feeling Cupid's was going to go. I gave him a couple other ones as well, but and there was one that was really close that I still think might happen. But yeah, they approve it and they sign it for a season. So roughly speaking, it's about 26 episodes. With Warning Label, it did well enough off the bat that they decided that I could extend it, which was fantastic, because while the story never changed, it expanded. Like chapters got broken in half and doubled it in size. That was a fantastic storytelling experience. And then with Cupid's Arrows, it's very much seasonal. So I'm doing about 26, 28 chapters a year.
So because I'm in Sonoma Valley, which is wine country, I have to ask you about time and vine. And you drink a glass of wine and it takes you to the time it was bottled. And wouldn't that be awesome? I love that idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw a tweet from my friend Kurt Busick that said something about a comic book based in a winery, and all of a sudden it just hit me how to do it. It's one of those stories that came almost completely fully formed. And even the things that I didn't have worked out, everything fell into place. There's a timing aspect to the ending that wasn't planned when I wrote it, but the numbers lined up so perfectly that it's hard to believe it wasn't there all the time. And the best part was doing the research. So it takes place in New York wine country because I wanted to be able to play against the American Revolution and Civil War. And there's a winery in upstate New York called Brotherhood Winery. It is the oldest winery in the United States. It's been around since before the Civil War. It survived Prohibition by selling church wine, and champagne was considered medicinal. So you could make that and get a prescription for it. So I got to go up there a couple times and walk around the yard and buy wine. And Ohio, where I'm at, has lots of good wineries out in the River Valley, or Hudson River Valley, Chagrin River Valley. And I have friends who actually work at those, who are able to give me tours and walk me through the process of running a winery and, borrow the way those things look. And yeah, it's just I don't know, it's a very special, very pretty, sweet story. And I'm very glad I got to write. It's the kind of thing that if you read, you believe that I would have written it, but it's not the kind of thing you thought that I would have written, if that makes any sense. It's just a little outside that comfort zone.
Yeah. And of course, here we pair wine with everything. So I was thinking in my head this morning, and you could take this idea and run with it. I was thinking you should do a web series where you pair a wine with an issue of the comic and host a reading of it and pair it with the wine, and you can have that.
Okay. Excellent.
I will help be a guest reader for you or something.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I think I would be remiss if I didn't bring up My Little Pony. You've been writing with them for 5 years, and everybody knows the name. I was walking around upstairs saying, I'm going to interview somebody who draws for or comes up with stories for My Little Pony, and the kids were like, I remember that show. I was wondering, how do you feel about bronies?
So I'm a Star Trek fan, so I'm used to people who are super way into something and a little socially awkward. I've gone to more than a few pony conventions, and I would say 90 to 95% of the bronies are fantastic and sweet and just the most loving fans. There's probably 5% that are weird, but every fandom has 5% weird. Like if you're at that number, it's, you're pretty good. It's still noticeable. They're the ones that draw the attention, but that pony fans and webtoon fans they experience the comics with a purity and a passion that you don't see a lot. And it is delightful to be part of that.
Well, what I love about that explanation is you just said that there's whole conventions for My Little Pony. And see, that's a world I didn't even know was out there.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have a favorite story that you've done with My Little Pony?
Oh, generally, I usually say that the last one I wrote is always my favorite. But there are two. There's a 3-part story where I turn them all evil. It's loosely based on an old Justice Society one, but I think per capita that's got just some of the best jokes. And I think it does really well because it turns all the things that make the ponies good into bad aspects of their personality. So Twilight Sparkle, who's very intelligent, becomes super arrogant about it. Rarity wants to impose her fashion on people. And then the other one I did, just because it's a one-shot and it is completely bizarre, is there's one called Apincalypse Now, where Pinkie Pie accidentally takes over Discord's dimension. And it is literally based on Apocalypse Now, where Colonel Kurtz goes native and they have to send the other ponies upriver to get him, or they send Martin Sheen up to get him. But yes, the cover I did is actually the Bob Peak. It's the kind of thing, because there's a lot of pop culture references in My Little Pony, but the important thing to me is that when you write something like that, it has to be funny because it's funny and not because you get the joke. So I think the story stands well on its own, but also I like being able to do Apocalypse Now with My Little Pony.
It's so fun. Do you think you have the best job in the world?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't think I would want to do anything else.
I know that a lot of the comic artists that travel the conventions, they do commissions. Is that something that you do also, if people are interested?
Yes, especially now. My website is thomz.com. You can contact me there, and yeah, I take commission requests there all the time.
And so what is your origin story? How did you get into all of this?
I was dropped on my head a lot when I was a kid because brain damage is important. I always knew I wanted to be a comic book artist. My parents had me reading from an early age. My dad was actually super Machiavellian about it. He read in a book that there's no reason a 2-year-old can't read. So he would run phonics lessons with me, but he would also stop just at the point that I wanted to do more, so that every day I was doing more with me. It's like, oh, come on, let's do more. And they use comics as a reward system. So like if I clean my room, I got a comic book. So I had a lot of comics and they had a really well-behaved kid. My dad had done art for a little bit. My aunt was in art. My grandfather painted signs for a little bit before going in the post office. So it was always an option. Like it wasn't like some out of the world crazy thing to say that you wanted to be an artist. It always seemed like it was more of an option with my family than anyone else, or than other families I knew, I should say. And they were very supportive of it. There was a lot of pushing back and forth, and educating about how freelance life works and what exactly this job is going to be like. But I went to the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art, now finally called the Kubert School, so I don't have to say all those words, in Dover, New Jersey. It's started by Joe Kubert, who worked on Hawkman and Sergeant Rock, and it was boot camp for artists, but that's where I went and trained, and that's why I'm able to do what I do.
Well, you've been listening to Hollywood and Sip. I'm still your host, Kat Smith, and we've been talking to Thom Zahler, whose Loving Capes Volume 5 is coming out in September. Give out all the information. How can they follow you, find the books, all of the things?
So I spell Thom with an H, Thom. So my website is Thomz. I am Thom Zahler, Thomzahler on Twitter and Instagram when I actually remember to post things. Those are those. And on Webtoon, look for Warning Label or Cupid's Arrows.
Love it. Thank you so much for talking today.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.